Yes.
I am, you who don't know me, I am Michal Siegal, and I'm a Talmud professor here virtually at the Goldstein-Goren Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University, and as the steering committee of the study of interreligious hosting our gathering tonight. Um, I'm honored and pleased to welcome you all to today's celebration of my very good friend, a brilliant scholar and a thought-provoking author, Katell Berthelot, on the publication of her new book, Jews and Their Roman Rivals, Pagan Rome's Challenge to Israel. I would have shown you the book, but I don't have a hard copy. I only read it on PDF, but I'm sure, as a hard copy. A graduate of the Sorbonne University, Professor Berthelot is currently professor at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, and a member of the Paul Albert Févier Research Center at Aix-en-Provence University. She's the author of a few books, editor of multiple volumes, and a writer of many prominent articles in the fields of history of Judaism in the Greco-Roman world, Dead Sea Scrolls, and rabbinic literature. She also knows, and I know this from personal experience, to bring her Israeli friends French cheese and cakes when she comes to visit. The book we gather to celebrate is a result of Berthelot's role as a principal investigator of the prestigious ERC Consolidator grant she won on the project Judaism and Rome. The book focuses on Greco-Roman contexts for three main corpora: the writings of Philo of Alexandria, the writing of Josephus, and rabbinic literature. Berthelot chooses to highlight the importance of the Roman context specifically and asks, what is the Jewish response to Rome's various challenges in these various writers and periods, emphasizing the similarities between the self-definitions of Rome and Israel. She delineates the specific nature of the Roman challenges. First, the Roman self-definition as the people who had the best laws and were elected by the gods. And second, Roman policies that led to the lasting erasure of the Jerusalem temple and the city itself, which could be interpreted as a desire to substitute Rome for Israel as the elected people. Katell concludes the Jewish responses to Roman domination were manifold, ranging from revolt and harsh criticism to accommodation, imitation, collaboration, and adhesion. Katell connects her conclusion to past trends and situates them in historical context of past empires, past and contemporary theological and theological claims. She differentiates between Josephus and Philo on the one hand and Palestinian rabbis on the other in regards to their sense of rivalry with Rome. But mostly, she deftly shows that whatever the nature of the reaction in the different corpora and the different texts that she checks, the encounter with Roman standards resulted in significant changes to Jewish discourses and self-definition. She demonstrated on conceptualization of the Torah as the civil law of Israel and conversion as adoption. Her book is extensive, full of sources, a good and interesting read, and mostly presents a good example of the way to ask a big question and answer it in a nuanced and thought-provoking way. And tonight, we shall hear more about that, and I look forward to what is promising to be an interesting evening. But before we begin, I need to thank some people and invite our head of the center to greet us and welcome us to this evening. So before we do that, I want to thank Raya, our boss and master in arms, who really enables everything that happens at the center, and she's a treasure and a wonderful help. So thank you so much, Raya, for organizing everything and putting this together. I want to really thank from the bottom of my heart both Seth and Maren for taking the time and investing in reading the book and commenting and agreeing to speak tonight. And I'm sure I'm speaking for Katell as well for thanking you for agreeing to do so. And thank you, Daniela, the head of the center, for hosting us tonight. And the floor is yours, Daniela.
Thank you, Michal. First of all, thank you for initiating this evening. It's the second out of 4 book events we had this year that is your initiative.
Oh, wow.
And yes. And so I'm it's a great contribution to our annual program, which is quite full, even without book events. But book events are really high points and really great opportunities to look beyond our usual work in our annual theme, which happens to be for this year rethinking center and periphery. We could find some points of intersection also with Katell's work, but I will not take this direction now. So I'm really happy to host this event, all the more so as this is an opportunity to meet again with you, Katell, who, and I must say that Katell and Michal recently, exactly a month ago, gave the center an opportunity to take part in a wonderful conference about Giyur and Gerim, conversion to Judaism, and gave us all an opportunity to return to the original theme of the center, religious conversion. So it was really a fine occasion. I'm also happy to welcome our guests, Professor Seth Schwartz and Maren Niehoff, and to thank Raya for organizing, as Michal so eloquently thanked already. And I also want to thank each and every one of you in the audience. I've already mentioned that this is an extremely busy time of the year. We've had a sequence of conferences and workshops during the last 4 weeks, and it's hard to end the semester properly and engage in all those occasions. But I'm really happy we have the opportunity to do so. As most of you know, I'm an Islamist and an historian of the medieval Middle East. So I must admit that I was a little wary that I will not find a specific point of intersection between Katell's work and my own interests, upon which I could reflect here, curious as I was to leaf through the book. Actually, I found that Katell addresses a topic that I've become more and more interested in lately, and in my favorite perspective, the comparative perspective. So, Katell, you've given me food for thought, and I'd like to share this small point with you all now very briefly. So the topic I'm alluding to is medieval, right? Jewish attitudes towards or discourse about Islamic rule over the land of Israel versus Christian rule. So something that hasn't been done as far as I'm aware of, and if anyone knows otherwise, please tell me. So the topic is how theologically and otherwise Jewish thinkers cope with this sorry situation of foreign rule, the rule of foreign empires over the land of Israel. So you write, Katell, engagement with the Roman Empire in its rule over the land of Israel poses a unique ideological challenge for the Jews, all the more after the destruction of the temple. This is from the introduction. But further down, Katell notes that while the legal, historical, Hellenistic mode of articulating claims to territory influenced Jewish articulation of the antiquity of their possession of the land of Israel, it's something that this was new to me, that goes back before the famous deal Abraham made, right? Even back to Adam, to the Roman notions of land ownership seem to have had no particular impact on the way Jews conceived of their relationship to the land of Israel, perhaps because Israel was already in exile. And yet, Rome is mentioned in a medieval Jewish text that attempts to cope with this challenge, the challenge that the loss of sovereignty over the land of Israel to a succession of empires, including the Islamic, poses before Jewish thinkers. So I'd like to bring a short excerpt from a commentary of the Jewish philosopher Rabbi Nissim of Marseille. He lived actually not far from you, right? In the late 13th and early 14th century. And his commentary on Leviticus 26:32. V'hashimoti ani et haaretz v'shamemu alea oivechem hayosvim ba. I will make the land desolate, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled by it. So Rabbi Nissim and Nachmanides, Haramban, before him, point out that the rule of foreigners over the land is doomed to be temporary and infertile. When Israel is away, writes Rabbi Nissim, our enemies cannot settle it. From the time of the destruction of the temple and until now, Rome, that had exiled us, held on to it, but just for a short while. And then came the Ishmaelites, who conquered it from them and rule it until our days. 3 times the Christians had it, and 3 times the Muslims. But all that time, neither nation enjoyed peace or security. Rather, they suffered constant fear of war and enmity from each other, and all that is the reason that the land remained desolate, שוממה. בזמן שאין ישראל עליה, אויבינו היושבים בה לא יוכלו ליישבה, מיום החורבן ועד עתה. רומי, שהגלתנו, החזיקה בזמן מה, אך לא ארוך, ואחר כך גברה יד הישמעאלים וניצחום, והחזיקו בה עד היום הזה. 3 פעמים הלכו בה הנוצרים, ו3 פעמים הישמעאלים, מיום חורבן הבית השני עד עתה. ואף הזמן שהחזיקה בה כל אחת משתי אומות אלה, לא ישבו בה בטח. רק תמיד כל פחדים באוזניהם ואימות מלחמות לישמעאלים מהנוצרים ולישמעאלים מהנוצרים ולנוצרים מהישמעאלים. וכל זה סיבה להיות הארץ שוממה. This is one more sentence. This is reminiscent of Ramban's better known commentary on the same verse and his startling metaphor for the rule of 2 foreign empires, again I'm speaking of the Christian and Islamic, over the land. So Ramban writes, and this is quite a well-known piece I think, I've envisioned you, my homeland, as a mother whose infant son died in her lap, and the milk in her breast is so painful that she nurses young dogs. They do not deserve you, and you do not deserve them. Our country does not embrace its enemies. Ever since we had left it, it did not receive a nation or tongue. They all failed to settle it. So, Katell addresses many other aspects than the challenge of the sovereignty over the land of Israel, of course. Many really interesting aspects, which our other speakers will undoubtedly address. So, I will conclude here. With, again, thanks to Michal and Raya and all our guests, and with a big mazal tov and yishar koach to Katell Berthelot. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for that. And we begin with Seth. Right? Am I right? Is it Seth or Maren first? I think it's Seth. Seth Schwartz is the Lucius Littauer, am I saying this correctly, Seth? Professor of Classical Jewish Civilization at Columbia University. Political, social, and cultural historians of Jews who specialize in the period between Alexander the Great and the rise of Islam, and has become especially interested in the anthropological and social theoretical aspects of his field. Among his books who made a huge impact on the field, we can name Josephus and the Judean Politics in 1920, almost 1990, Imperialism and Jewish Society. Seth, I just made you very, very old. 200 BC to 640 CE, winner of the National Jewish Book Award, were the Jews of Material Society in 2010, and the Ancient Jews from Alexander to Muhammad in Cambridge University Press in 2014. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. 1920 seems about right. Let me begin by thanking the indefatigable organizer of this event, Michal Siegal, for asking me to participate. I was going to say something also about your rector, Harvey, or Chaim Hames, who I was friends with in late antiquity, back in the late 1920s in Cambridge, the other Cambridge, Maren, and haven't actually seen in quite a while. But he said, I'm still not seeing him. So what can we do? And of course, we all have to thank Katell for writing such a splendid book, the celebration of which brings us together. So let me get down to business. The thesis of the book is clearly stated in its title, Jews and their Roman Rivals, Pagan Rome's Challenge to Israel. Many of you probably know that the idea that ancient Jewish literature, in particular rabbinic literature, but not only, can be best understood in part as an artifact of rivalry has been around for quite a while, with two well-known books having titles which are either explicitly similar or implicitly very similar to Katell's. Of course, I'm referring to Mark Hirschman's Rivalry of Genius, excuse me, not Jesus, but Genius, and Yisrael Yuval's Shnei Goyim B'Vit Nech. We can also add to this list Daniel Boyarin's, which doesn't, the titles aren't that relevant, Daniel Boyarin's Dying for God and Borderlines, and much of the writing that's emerged from Boyarin's atelier. Hirschman's focus, to be sure, is rather restricted, but I have thought for a long time that the other works suffered, hermeneutically speaking, from their focus on Christianity. Scholars were led astray, in my opinion, by the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, which caused them to ignore the fact that in the context in which rabbinic traditions took shape, traditional Roman religion and culture, bracketing any definition of those terms for the time being, long remained far more important. This is comparable to the practice of older biblical scholars of overvaluing Mesopotamia as a context because of the linguistic connection between Akkadian and Hebrew, while undervaluing Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. Anyway, historicizing rabbinists should have paid much more attention to pre-Constantinian, or let me be slightly pedantic and say pre-Theodosian Rome. And the content of this pedantry is that Rome didn't suddenly become Christian when Constantine converted to Christianity. I think in some ways a more important landmark on the road to Christianity, to the Christianization of the empire, was the Edict of Thessalonica, one of the first legislative acts by the Emperor Theodosius I in 379, which declared the emperor's will that all of his subjects should be Nicene Christians. Now, Katell has actually done what I said needs to be done before the pedantic parenthesis. This is a significant advance in several ways. For example, explicit anti-Christian polemic is notoriously hard to find in rabbinic texts, with a handful of well-known and worked-to-death exceptions. This is true even for Midrash Agadah, compiled deep in the late empire or even beyond, about as unambiguously Christian as any state could be. One of the core methodological problems with the work of Hirschman and Yuval, there are other issues with Boyarin, is that they have to posit concealed or implicit polemic. But if the rabbis wanted to polemicize against Christians, why not just do it? By the 6th century, we have plenty of piyutim, for example, which are quite open in their criticism of Christianity. Why would the tradents and editors of the Mishnah, Palestinian Talmud, and Midrashim have needed to hide their true intentions? Another target of Katell's book, which I think is implicit, it's not really fully articulated, and it's a somewhat old view, which is still around, it hasn't been fully articulated, is the tendency of many Judaic scholars to conflate the Hellenistic world and the Roman imperial East. Developments actually typical of the empire, for example, rampant urbanization in many areas, the empire-wide standardization of civil life, both issues which were of central importance, not just for the rabbis, but for Josephus and Philo, and importantly for Katell's argument, an expansive conceptualization of citizenship, were achievements of the Roman empire, not of the Hellenistic kingdoms, primarily. Katell's focus on the pagan empire thus provides a crucial and urgent corrective. The book has an ideational and hermeneutical advantage. The hostility of rabbinic texts, especially Palestinian rabbinic texts, to the traditional Roman Empire is abundantly present right on the surface of the text. We do not need any fancy exegesis to detect it. The search for anti-Christian polemic, or alternatively, depending on the disposition of the scholar, the decision to read rabbinic texts with Christian intertexts had always, by contrast, involved the leap of faith or derived its power from the exegetical ingenuity of the interpreter. So Katell Berthelot's resituation of rabbinic literature in the intellectual environment of the high Roman Empire is an important and strikingly novel contribution. I would like to add that simply as a piece of technical scholarship, the book is meticulous. It is up to date and well informed about a vast range of subjects and primary sources. And even I've written in my texts, I've called myself a crypto pedant, but I'm not sure it's so crypto. I don't know whether people experience my pedantry as such, but I'm very, very pedantic. And if I see errors of translation, it kind of destroys my belief in the text. And there was nothing doing that here. So keep that in mind, all of you. I can find very little to criticize on that front. in Katell's book. Katell systematically makes the case that from the Jews' perspective, the Romans were special. They were not still another in the line of patrimonial empires under whose rule the Jews were apparently fated to live. They made claims and demands that went beyond mere resource extraction and personal loyalty to members of a dynasty. They were a people, notwithstanding their heterogeneity and claims of non-autochthony. They had a special relationship to their gods. They were highly militaristic, and they ascribed special importance to their laws. In some, unlike the Babylonians, Persians, and Macedonians, among others, their self-understanding was remarkably like that of the Jews. This extends even, if only to a small extent, to their militarism. This fact was the reason that the Roman Empire challenged the Jews more than any pre-modern empire. Katell then systematically examines each topic from both the Roman and the Jewish side, arguing that Jewish literature, meaning mainly Philo, Josephus, and the Palestinian rabbinic texts, bear many traces of the Jews' sense of rivalry with the Romans over these claims. This works best for me when the texts are at their most concrete, in my opinion. For example, rabbinic law has features which, as is well known, are unattested in biblical law or any earlier version of Jewish law, but which are a standard feature of Roman law. To take a fairly straightforward example, the partial enfranchisement of manumitted slaves. It's a well-known issue. In general, given the evidence both from within and from outside rabbinic literature that in real life, the role of rabbis starting at least in the 3rd century CE was to be legal experts and arbitrators, it is perfectly obvious that as a group, they would have had plenty of experience with Roman law as a lived system, if not necessarily with the more academic or theoretical aspects of Roman law. Likewise, the idea that though the Mishnah is admittedly not a very Roman text, I think, it reflects a reconception of Jewish law as a kind of native version of Roman jus civile. Thus, it is essentially inward turning and also elaborated to a high degree of specificity in a way arguably similar to the lost pre-Theodosian codification efforts. This is also part of a larger argument about the inward turn of Jewish law. Katell posits, and I'm quoting, a shift from a conception of the Mosaic law as universal, rational, and philosophical to the rabbinic view of the Torah as the exclusive legislation of the Jewish people, end quote, and claims that, and I'm quoting again, that it is in part a response to the valorization of Roman positive law in Roman culture. This is a very bold thesis that I am still mulling over. I am not sure whether to follow Katell in seeing historical development here or whether to think more about issues of genre. Few pre-70 texts are technically law books. They are apologetic, like Aristeas, or wisdom books like Ben Sira. These texts praise the law and defend it and contemplate its value. But only the Mishnah gives the lawyer's eye view. Some pre-70 fragments of actual legal discourse, like 4Q, Miksat Maaseh HaTorah, sound much more like the Mishnah than they sound like Ben Sira's Encomium of the law, although other texts, pre-70 legal texts like the Temple Scroll don't. They don't sound anything like the Mishnah. Yet there's some reason to believe that in some times and places, some versions of Jewish law, including civil law, were actually practiced, as in the famous Politoma of Hellenistic Heracleopolis in Egypt, where we have this series of papyri from the middle of the 2nd century BCE, which claim to be using the politikoi nomoi, that is the, that's actually Roman jus civile is a calque of the Greek nomos politikos, it's the same thing. The civil law, the political laws of the Jews, and perhaps more importantly in pre-66 Judea, more importantly only because the hall of Jewish legal exegesis from Heracleopolis is actually very slight. Unlike, for example, marriage contracts, of which we have a fair number from pre-70 or around 70 Judea and other similar sorts of documents. The documents that these legal cultures produced presuppose Mishnah-like, if not specifically Mishnaic, interpretive practices. The Mishnah indubitably ultimately reflects the interests of those practitioners and their successors, and not of philosophers and teachers of wisdom. Could Katell still be right that as a corporation, the rabbis had the Roman example before them when they decided to collect and refine all the accumulated lore and practice? Yes, I think she could be. The utter novelty of the Mishnah demands a strong explanation, or perhaps rather a set of explanations. And perhaps we can actually think of additional things. We don't have to opt for a monocausal approach to it. And while accepting the idea that the kind of Roman internalization of the category of law as a high value somehow had an impact, even a very strong impact on the rabbis. We could also think of other things. I've thought, for example, about like a Jonathan Z. Smith-like approach. Smith argued that apocalypticism is what happens when sages lose their authorization and are left to resort to fantasy. It could be that the Mishnah is likewise what happens when scribes and judges are put out of business and left to their fantasies. On a close reading of Katell's explanations, they're never in fact meant as monocausal. She's actually very careful about that point, and is careful to say that they're intended to be partial and don't exclude other possibilities. So sometimes where Katell, and another issue where Katell adopts a very bold interpretation, which actually is quite challenging. And we have to recognize that there's a sharp radical claim being made here, where there's room for a lot of discussion. Sometimes where Katell sees sophisticated rabbinic critique of Roman ideas, I confess I still sometimes see rabbinic ignorance. Though here too, maybe I'm simply struggling with the boldness of Katell's argument. So an opinion quoted in the Mishnah prohibits images of a human type figure carrying a globe. It was presumably with the understanding that the globe was a standard part of the iconography of emperors and of imperial gods like Sol Invictus. But the Talmud at Yerushalmi Avodah Zarah 3.1 instead explains it with a tall tale derived from the extensive Vulgate tradition about Alexander the Great, and furthermore insists that the globe represents only land and not the sea. Katell sees in this satire or farce, and though this seems conceivable here, the theme of emperors ruling only the land is repeated in several different contexts in the Yerushalmi, not just in this context. Not all of them seem to be so completely suited to a farcical reading. And it flies, of course, utterly in the face of Roman imperial propaganda, starting with the res gestae divi Augusti. Like so many rabbinic stories involving emperors, my assumption has always been that this demonstrates the rabbi's social distance from the centers of power, in contrast to Philo and Josephus. These were, after all, the same men who entertained the possibility that an emperor of the Severan dynasty had converted to Judaism, and that Roman aristocrats and Roman aristocratic women, maybe especially, but not only, could sling biblical verses side by side with rabbis, all of which is emphatically implausible. Of course, one could actually stick with the farce thing, and one could slightly reorienting Katell's argument, or maybe even not so much, think in terms of intentional acts of abjection by the rabbis to explain all these cases. They produced self-consciously distorted and absurd accounts of Roman rule, no matter what the context. This was simply how they always described Roman rule, in this abjected, intentionally farcical and silly way. That's a very serious idea. And one which I think requires really careful consideration and analysis. Now, I'd like to step back. I mean, Katell is a historian of ideas, and I'm a materialist. I don't really understand ideas. And I want to sort of explore briefly the topic of Katell's final chapter, which is about citizenship and the impact of Roman ideas about citizenship and adoption also. I'm leaving that to some extent aside, on the Jews, and think about how it sort of meshes with Katell's argument in the last chapter of her book. And I'm trying to embed Katell's reading in a historical context that she doesn't actually articulate. I'm articulating, but I think that it's actually there, and it can add force and urgency to her account. So I'm going to talk about the impact of the universal grant of citizenship in the year 212 by the Emperor Caracalla, the so-called Constitutio Antoniniana. And I'm going to start with the basic question, which is also where Katell starts. What do we know about the impact of the Constitutio Antoniniana on the Jews of the empire in general? Well, the Constitutio Antoniniana was an important step in the direction of the Roman Empire's changing course. It was moving from a plain old empire, central metropolis ruling over subjects, to something more like an imperial state, where the pyramid is substantially flattened. The hierarchies are flattened out quite a lot, and everyone's a citizen. Everyone is supposed to have some stake and things. They're not just there any longer simply to be exploited, although of course they are there to be exploited. Other stations on the way to this development, I would suggest, were the Dacian persecution of 250, the Great Persecution of 303 to 311, the conversion of Constantine, and so on. But obviously, the Constitutio Antoniniana, Caracalla's decree, was crucial. Though the decree appears to say that the universal grant of citizenship would not automatically or immediately overturn all prior legal or constitutional arrangements, the seeds for such a revolution may nevertheless have been present in the decree itself. Caracalla seems to state that he wants to make all of his subjects citizens because his free subject citizens because he wants to extend the worship of the Roman gods. This anticipates what we can reconstruct of the Emperor Decius's religious decree a few decades later in 250, the point of which is again to ensure the universality of sacrifice, this time through direct bureaucratic intervention. Here, still deep in pagan times and pre-Christian times, we are conceptually only a hair away from Theodosius I's decree of 379, which I mentioned earlier, where the emperor declares it his will that all his subjects be Nicene Christians, Orthodox Christians. One of the lessons of all this, which is not really what I'm focusing on, is that the Roman imperial state was usually not religiously neutral. Contrary to what we tend to think, we can actually tentatively reconstruct how some Jews received the Constitutio Antoniniana. In some places, the evidence is actually surprisingly abundant. Beneficiaries of Caracalla's decrees received the family name Aurelius, or Aurelia, if they were women, which allows us, at least to some extent, to trace aspects of the decree's reception. Because if you use the name Aurelius on a decree after 212, then it shows that you were proud or advertising or willing to admit that you have received your citizenship as a gift from the emperor, and you're embracing that fact. In Asia Minor, there's ample onomastic evidence from Phrygian Hierapolis and from Sardis that Jews embraced citizenship enthusiastically, as Asian Greeks more generally seem to have done too, especially away from the ancient Greek cities of the coast. By contrast, among the 600-odd inscriptions from the Roman Jewish catacombs, many of which were surely, and surely in academic jargon means maybe, carved during the period from 212 to 350, which is when the name was still in wide use, went out of fashion after 350. Only 12 inscriptions use the name Aurelius, and only one from the large Monteverde catacomb, which yielded 200 inscriptions. It's often been supposed, based on a comment of Philo, if I'm remembering correctly, that Roman Jews were generally of servile origin, even more so than the Roman plebs more generally. If this is correct, which it probably isn't, then very many, if not most, Roman Jews already possess citizenship in 212. The Finnish scholar Eero Kajanto found in a study of the inscriptions of the city of Rome that many inscriptions mention people with imperial names, which usually points towards their having been freed slaves in the family of the emperor, in the larger slave family of the emperor, with the name Julius being the most common. But Aurelius is also extremely common in Rome, and he counted 35 columns of Aurelii from the city of Rome alone, which is a lot of people. Now, it's rather difficult to tell from this without doing any number crunching if the percentage of Jewish Aurelii at Rome is normal or not, or is there something anomalous about it? I'll have to get back to that. Finally, the two main chronologically relevant Jewish necropolis from Rome and Palestine are those of Beit Sha'arim and Yaffo. These have yielded not a single Aurelius. Indeed, there is no Jewish Aurelius or Aurelia anywhere in the province of Palestine, and the measly 14 attested Aurelii in the province in general, and they are demonstrably, for the most part, pagans in every case. It must be admitted that high imperial epigraphy in Palestine is not abundant, with inscriptions clumping both earlier and later, but Yaffo and Beit Sha'arim do seem to belong on the whole to the correct period. So they should, if they were like Asia Minor or even like Rome, have some Aurelii or Aurelii in the mix. At the same time, even in Asia Minor, there's a marked tendency in the years around the Dacian persecution, by the way, I'm almost finished here, in 250, for epigraphy to provide evidence for the reemergence of some limited expressions of institutional Judaism after a rather long break. The same is perhaps true for the city of Rome, where so many deceased Jews were communal functionaries, and for Palestine as well. In other words, just at the moment when, immediately after 212, an imperial rescript informed the Jews that their official communities lacked legal personality, such communities began a comeback. And this seems true whether or not the Jews welcomed the Constitutio Antoniniana, as in Asia, or to all appearances spurned it, as in Palestine. This suggests that the impacts on the Jews of the empire's development into an imperial state worked independently of the question of the Jews' reception of the imperial decrees that spurred the development. Such considerations work at a certain remove from Katell's approach. That is, they can't either prove it or disprove the validity of Katell's approach. And Katell's approach seems to require rabbinic intentionality in coping with Roman rule. And the data that I've brought to bear here doesn't actually tell us which one is more likely. But they do sharpen her questions and can also serve as a materialist infrastructure to the idealist history that Katell is practicing. If Katell is right to suppose that rabbinic conversion was meant to compete with and even supplant Roman citizenship, aside from, in broad terms, not precisely, but in broad terms, aside from being informed by Roman adoption laws, then I would add that the rabbis were not acting in a vacuum, but quite conceivably in a setting where Caracalla's decree was met with apathy, if not aversion, and where, whatever the subjectivities of the Jews, it was functioning to enhance their internal institutional identities. This is just one example of the way in which Katell's book and all its idealism is useful and even inspiring to historians of a grittier temperament, such as myself. I have many, many more things to say about Katell's book. I wrote a lot, 10,000 words of notes about it, which I will not recite today. But for now, let me just conclude by saying that whatever small cavils I've expressed, not really cavils, but the book is essentially convincing. Katell Berthelot has succeeded spectacularly in shifting our attention back where it belongs, to the good old Roman Empire, as it were, and in demonstrating just how much rabbinic literature, and not only rabbinic literature, is indebted to its ineffably complex relationship to what was beginning to emerge in the time of its formulation as the first imperial state in the history of the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. This was wonderfully detailed and a lot of food for thought. And we turn to our next speaker, Professor Maren Niehoff. She is the Max Cooper Professor of Ancient Thought at the Hebrew University and member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. She specializes in interdisciplinary research in Hellenistic and Rabbinic Judaism, as well as early Christianity and the Greco-Roman culture. She's the author of multiple volumes. Among them, we can list Philo of Alexandria, an intellectual biography that came out in 2018, which I have discovered in preparing to this, that was translated in Hebrew, German, Italian, and French. So wonderful achievement. The figure of Joseph in post-biblical Jewish literature in 1992, Philo in Jewish Identity and Culture in 2001, and Jewish Exegesis and Homeric Scholarship in Alexandria in 2011. Maren, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for organizing this, and congratulations, Katell, for this book. Really a remarkable and very also voluminous conclusion of your project. And I read it with a great interest. And of course, I read it primarily or initially from a philonic perspective, as you will have expected. And I was really absolutely delighted to have so much Philo and have so much Josephus in the book. And that is not at all self-evident. And I think that the kind of triangular comparison that you have proposed here is really extremely important, and also ties in with what Seth really has emphasized, namely the importance of the Roman Empire. And as I understand it, what you propose here is really a comparison of the different Jewish voices in their different chronological and geographical situations to kind of central themes of the encounter between Jews and Romans. And I'm extremely grateful that Philo and Josephus have such an important place here, and that also I seem to have convinced you that really Philo belongs in this Roman context, and that particularly his later works can be used as a key to understanding his encounter with Roman discourses. And I was particularly pleased really in chapter 2 about the Roman virtues and the discussion, how these come along. And it seems to me that the comparison between Philo, Josephus, and Josephus on the one hand, and the rabbis on the other hand, is really extremely convincing, and also teaches us something about continuities between center and periphery, and also helps us really to kind of decentralize our canonical view that still posits a great dichotomy, basically, between kind of anything prior to the rabbis and then rabbinic literature. Now, of course, Philo and Josephus and Ben Sira and all the other sources that you have mentioned, they don't all belong to kind of one type of Judaism. And I think you have done a really great job kind of analyzing each of them in their particular perspective, and also highlighting the often apologetic intent of Josephus and Philo, and then comparing with this, comparing the rabbis with this. And I think this approach is extremely important, and I really hope that it will kind of take on, and that people will follow in your steps and do further comparisons. And I think that this also can very much help us with the evaluation of 212 and the impact of the extension of Roman citizenship, because if we do take into account earlier Jewish voices, we actually see that many of the processes that are perhaps more visible in rabbinic literature, in fact, started much earlier. And so we can put the kind of the crucial event in 212 and often overinterpreted the event of 212 and the citizenship as such in a much broader perspective. So I think that's really an important step forward, and I think that's the way that all these issues should really be studied in this triangular way. So thanks a lot, and really chapeau for kind of carving out this particular path, which I think is really important. I have two queries that I want to voice, and one has to do with kind of Roman notions of eradication that I was a bit worried about, and I'm not so sure how central it is, but I did see it as some kind of thread in the book, and I really want to know your response to it. And the other has to do with the sources that you yourself mentioned, the rabbinic sources that you yourself mentioned are very difficult to date, and I really want to have your response to some of the questions that I had there. So the first point, the eradication of the Jewish cult. Katell, we are in a very small group here, so I can just say you Katell, on page 3, you describe very clearly the intent of the whole book, and you say a central thesis of this monograph is that in spite of this historical background, the Roman Empire represented. Do you hear me? Okay, represented a qualitatively different challenge than those Israel had previously encountered. This book argues that two main factors distinguishes Rome from earlier powers. The first lies in the paradoxical similarities between Roman and Jewish self-definition. The second in Rome's policy towards the Jews from the reign of Vespasian to that of Hadrian, which could be, and now I emphasize, interpreted as an attempt to eradicate the Jewish cult and replace Jerusalem with Rome. And then there is some further detail, which I won't mention now because we have already heard it from Seth, about the rivalry of self-definition of the peoples. But as I said, I want to ask about this attempt to eradicate the Jewish cult and replace Jerusalem with Rome. For which I didn't really find any evidence, and but I assume that Katell, that you were implying or implicitly referring to the Historia Augusta, which suggests that the Bar Kokhba War was caused by a general ban on circumcision. And that is often identified with an attempt to eradicate Judaism. I think, however, that Benjamin Isaac has, I think, conclusively shown that the Historia Augusta is unreliable in this as well as on many other matters. And as he concludes, there never was a general ban on circumcision, neither before nor after the revolt, which would in any case have contradicted Roman policies concerning foreign cults. And that's in an essay from 203, and then also in his big book, The Invention of Racism. This introduction about the evasion of Judaism, the topic comes up also later on. So, for example, on page 272, the rabbis, must have been keenly aware that no legal system can endure without actually being put into practice, and that it was thus a matter of survival for Jewish law to continue to be applied one way or the other. Defining Jewish law and safeguarding its implementation in the lives of at least some Jews was thus of crucial importance if it was to survive at all in the imperial legal context. So Katell does, of course, acknowledge that the Roman legislation did appear, especially in the high Roman Empire, did categorically and in principle acknowledge local law, and in fact created a special category for it. And Philo and Josephus were really enthusiastic about this Roman notion of accepting the laws of the fathers, mos maiorum, and so there was this category, and as far as I can see, and this is here kind of my perspective that I want to introduce, Katell, and have your opinion. As far as I can see, the kind of rabbinic law is really quite revolutionary in Judaism, and it seems to me to be strikingly different from biblical law and law at Qumran, mostly because of its emphasis that debate between rabbis and debate between different schools is in fact the technique to arrive at a legal decision. So it's no longer God, as in the Bible, who dictates what is to be done as his kind of personal wish, but it is rather legal experts who actually debate among themselves, and whoever provides the more convincing arguments is the one who will be dominant and will be decisive. And the rabbis obviously developed this in a Roman context, in the Roman Empire, with Roman support. The patriarchs were supported also financially by the Roman Empire. So I wonder whether it is really a question of the survival of Jewish law, which was threatened to be eradicated by the Roman Empire, or whether it was the creation of rabbinic law in the Roman Empire. And my final point concerning this notion of eradicating the Jewish cult comes from the very last page, I think, of the book, where you write, Katell, on page 432. Interestingly enough, these issues are still relevant in a contemporary context. The problem of God's silence and passivity in the face of Jewish suffering became more acute than ever with the Shoah. So my question is whether the emphasis on the eradication, the danger of eradicating Jewish law and perhaps Judaism as a whole may be connected, as you put it in the very last, on the very last page, to our modern notions and our experience after the trauma of the Shoah. And recently, I unfortunately had to deal with a great deal with this issue, and particularly in modern scholarship, where we really discovered at a lexicon, a German lexicon, Reallexikon für Antike and Christentum, a bold traces of Nazism in the early volumes. And I had to rewrite the article and write an introduction. And in this context, I dealt with this quite a lot. And I really reached the conclusion that with Shia Cohen and others, and John Collins and others, that there is a great difference between the Nazi ideology and the Roman Empire. And I will quote John Collins, which I think is extremely pertinent here. So the riots, he says this about the riots in Alexandria, cannot be compared to Hitler's final solution. The enormity of the German project cannot be diluted by claiming that it was only an instance of a perennial phenomenon. So given this perspective, I just wanted to ask about this idea and see how you whether this is really such a dominant theme as I had the impression, or perhaps I over-interpreted this, but I really wanted to have your opinion, and particularly also whether you think there may be a connection. The second issue is the one of the dating of the rabbinic sources. And Katell very wisely and very cautiously discusses all the various options of how to study the rabbinic sources. And I really admired here also the discussion of hybridity and post-colonialism and all the, I mean, really all the possible options that are available. And I found that your discussion of them was extremely cautious, interesting, and really up to date. And I think with the same caution, you also, on page 27, you speak about the rabbinic dating. And obviously, since you are interested in the Roman Empire, you are very keen and rightly so to really get at the rabbinic sources that can be more or less securely dated to a pre-Christian, to the pre-Christian era. And then you rightly say that on the whole, the traditions gathered in the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Halachic Midrashim can be dated confidently to the period before Christianization, whereas the final elaboration of other works, the Jerusalem Talmud, later Midrashim, such as Genesis Rabbah and Leviticus Rabbah, took place during the 4th and 5th century, namely in a Christian context. So that's very clear. And I think your methodological commitment is also very, very clear. In the particular discussion of the specific details that you discuss, I found that very often then the main argument, nevertheless, is from Genesis Rabbah. There are many wonderful midrashim about the rivalry between the Jews and Rome, Esau, and sibling rivalry, and also many stories about the emperors. And I found that inevitably, often we jump from a question or a proposition straight to Genesis Rabbah, without going through the Mishnah and the Tosefta, which seem to be the most the kind of the securest candidates for analysis, given that they certainly belong to the pre-Christian period. So, for example, on page 286, we can now look at how Jewish works from the Roman period conceptualized the opposition between Israel's Torah and the laws of the nations, and what this may teach us about the Jews' potential sense of rivalry with the Romans in the legal realm. And then come examples from Genesis Rabbah. So I wanted to ask you about the role of Genesis Rabbah. I mean, you did mention that also the later midrashim do contain, and obviously we all know this, contain earlier materials. So is it that you identify these as earlier materials, or how sure can we be that even though they appear in Genesis Rabbah, they in fact kind of reflect the same kind of spirit of the Roman Empire? Or is it, as also Seth perhaps already indicated, or is it rather the fact, as you say, that the Christianization was kind of, the process of Christianization was a very long and regionally a different process. So perhaps what you're saying then is that we can nevertheless, even though Genesis Rabbah was redacted in the Christian period, maybe we can nevertheless secure it as a source that speaks about the Roman Empire, because Christianization had not yet reached. But then again, it seems that the Holy Land was particularly prone to Christianization, precisely because it became so quickly the Holy Land of the Christians. So even though in other parts of the empire, Christianization may have been much more slow, it seems that precisely in this area, it moved forward, in fact, very quickly. Then there is another issue, another source that I found surprising, and I'm really eager to hear your further comments on this. And this is on 273, where you say most of the issues discussed in rabbinic literature would have been of no concern to imperial authorities. This is vividly illustrated in a passage from the book of Acts in the New Testament, even though it pertains to an earlier period and different context. And then we have a story about Paul. So I really wanted to ask you, was there no story from the vast corpus of rabbinic literature? And if so, perhaps that is more telling than Paul, the Jew, who believed, who nevertheless, as far as I can see, did believe in Jesus as Christ. My last question is about the use of sources of Roman sources for the idea of rivalry, and also for the idea of kind of Roman superiority on legal grounds. Now, it seems to me that you have shown extremely well that Cicero and others had this sense that we have the best laws in the world, and therefore the kind of Roman Empire surely is superior to that of the Greeks. And he often speaks about Lycurgus and others. And I think you have demonstrated his pride extremely well and nicely, right at the time of transition from the Republic to the Principate. what raised more questions in me was that for the later period, we don't get the kind of the leading Roman jurists like Ulpian, Gaius, and others for these kind of views. So then for the later Roman Empire, we get Aelius Aristides, Gregory Thaumaturgus, the student of Origen, and these of course were orators, and they were giving their speeches, and obviously also they delighted in provocative and flattering motifs. So my question then is, given that we have Roman writers, and certainly also we have Roman poetry that speaks about Urbs as Orbus and identifies the city of Rome with the empire. All that is very well demonstrated. My question is, for the time of the rabbis, what was the real impact on the kind of daily legal practice? As far as I know, Ulpian had a kind of he was, as far as scholars reconstruct, probably of a Stoic orientation, humanistic approach. I never saw in all the works that have been written on him any suggestion that he had this idea of a kind of a divine mission of Rome, and so I just wonder whether the rhetoric of the orators at different periods really had such an impact on the kind of daily legal practice. And connected to this, and this is my last. Connected to this, and this is my last question, is really also the question of kind of local interest and voluntary use of Roman law. And you have discussed this, I think, very nicely under two rubrics. One is a kind of a practical approach, right? A practical approach, or perhaps, and sometimes you also call it a kind of opportunistic approach, where they could, the kind of the model of the shopping, where people could get their best deal. That's where they went, and if it was in the Roman law court, that's where they would go. And so I just wonder whether there is perhaps more to be said. And here I also want to raise a kind of a gender question, because it seems to me that Dionysia is mentioned in your book, and she gets a report, the famous case in Egypt where Dionysia was threatened by her father to have to divorce her husband because the father wanted the money back, and she employed lawyers and went to the Roman court. And there are other cases of women appealing to Roman courts. And so I just wonder whether there is something kind of a positive role, perhaps that perhaps also some of the rabbis realized, and others certainly did not, but some may have in fact realized it and used it, and in fact used it not only to conceive themselves as legal experts as opposed to other Jews, and thus also to achieve domination among the Jews as legal experts in a Roman style, but also to kind of conceive of the way that law can be done and legal decisions can be reached in this sort of fashion. So whether, in other words, Roman jurisprudence could also be seen by certain rabbis as allies, perhaps even as allies in the rivalry with other Jewish groups. So that would be the question that I would want to ask you. And again, thank you very much for the book, and thank you very much for raising all these interesting issues that I'm really eager to hear your response to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maren, for these wonderful, wonderful, thought-provoking comments. And we finally turn to our esteemed writer and the reason for us being here and celebrating this wonderful event. And Katell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michal, and thank you so much for organizing this event. And thanks a lot also to Daniela and to Raya. And above all, of course, thank you to both Seth and Maren for engaging the book with such depth and seriousness. And thank you for really very interesting questions and comments to which I am now going to turn. So I suppose it would be better to just start with Seth's remarks and go a little bit systematically through them, well, even though time is running. So I wanted to just to make clear a little point that you mentioned, Seth, concerning the fact that in the history of Jewish law, there were cases in which the Torah could be used as a kind of jus civile, for instance, in the context of the Politemata in Egypt. And I just wanted to make clear that for me, what was new in the rabbis' claims
getting into bed
concerning Torah as a kind of jus civile for Israel was that I was not speaking in that context about practice, but about an ideological discourse by the rabbis, like saying the Torah is exclusively Israel's law, in contrast to previous Jewish views that saw the Torah as a universal law. It was not at all on the level of practice, of legal practice in that case, in that passage. So that was just one first thing. Concerning the irony, the farce in connection with the passage in the Yerushalmi, Avodah Zarah, I think I didn't mean really to say that it was only ironical. And I think I would even say that it is a kind of serious response to Roman claims to have power on land and sea. And especially the passage with Rabbi Zeira, which comes just after the discussion of Alexander the Great, indicates, in my opinion, quite clearly that they are really trying to say, no, your power is not as absolute as you think. So it's a kind of political answer in a way, which is both ironical to some extent, but also serious to some extent. So it can be read both ways, and they are not, they are complementary in my view. But I wouldn't really see that as a matter of ignorance. To actually, even though it could be said that, land and sea was a kind of common expression, but I think it shows that the rabbis knew that this was part of the Roman political language, that they were putting the emphasis both in discourse and in visual art, I mean, in iconography, on this domination over land and sea as something that the Romans had achieved. So I would consider it a response that is not that badly informed on the rabbi's part. So your next comment, or let's say suggestion of further research maybe, deals with the Constitutio Antoniniana and the epigraphic evidence. And I think you are absolutely right that the epigraphic evidence could probably have been looked at in further depth, and that's something maybe to pursue in the future. So I mentioned in my book that we do not have that much evidence, but that the papyri and the inscriptions with the name Aurelius, Aurelia, in general, I mean, for Roman historians are one of the key elements to take into account now. But it's true that maybe in some cases we could look more closely at whether these people bearing the name Aurelius Aurelia are Jews or not. I simply wonder how much is this going to tell us about the way Jews reacted to the grant of Roman citizenship? Because again, what are the reasons for using a Hebrew name in an epitaph rather than a Roman name? If you're very keen to put the emphasis on your ancestral traditions and the use of Hebrew or Aramaic, you may just simply choose to refer to yourself as Yosef, son of Mattatyahu, not to say that you're Flavius Josephus. So this is also a matter of context. So what are these inscriptions? Especially in epitaphs, I think there are many reasons for not using a Roman name, even if you had it. So again, this is an interesting avenue, but it raises further questions as what we can make of this evidence and how to interpret it. Then you mentioned during that same period, there was a return to a clearer form of Jewish institutional life. And this is extremely interesting. And thank you very much for this comment. This again raises the question of the impact of the Constitutio Antoniniana at a different level this time. Namely, if Jews have become broadly, in general, have become Romans because of the Constitutio Antoniniana, then maybe there is an increased need to articulate a specific identity, a specific way of a collective identity, a collective organization. So in a way, it could also be seen as a kind of consequence of the Constitutio Antoniniana. But this may need further reflection. It's just reacting spontaneously to your suggestion. Concerning conversion, I just wanted to clarify that precisely in the case of conversion, I am not arguing that there was a rivalry between the rabbis and Rome, or Roman practices of citizenship and grants of citizenship, etc. Even in the case of Philo and Josephus, in this case, what they attempt to do is to say we are implicitly, we are as good as you. But I have not found any instance where really Philo or Josephus would claim that Jews are more welcoming than the Romans. So, so in that respect, this is maybe the one case in the book that I'm not claiming that there is a rivalry, a competition between Jews and Romans in the field of, or as far as gaining new members is concerned. Like that, they're not interested in extending what they call Jewish citizenship indefinitely or in a universal way. I don't see that in the rabbis, but I don't see it either in Philo and Josephus. They don't have this kind of universal citizenship model. The true rivals for Rome will be the Christians. It's the Christians who want to have a kind of universal people or a kind of universal community gathering people from all kinds of ethne and languages, et cetera, as we see in some Christian sources. So I hope that this answers your questions. And thank you again for very, very stimulating remarks and ideas for how to continue and combine further both the idealist type of history, as you want to call it, and the more materialist one. And now I turn to Maren's remarks. And thank you again, Maren. I really, really appreciate everything you've said. So first, the issue of eradication. I think there is a slight misunderstanding here, but you pointed out that this was an open question. So I never meant to say that the Romans wanted to eradicate Judaism or that they wanted to eradicate the Jewish people. What I said is that some Jews may have perceived Rome as trying to eradicate the Jewish cult, meaning the Jewish sacrificial cult, the cult at the temple. And I think in that sense, it's not only that Jews could have perceived that. In that case, I think Romans really wanted to put an end to the sacrificial cult. Because if not, then why would have Vespasian decided to destroy or or close the Jewish temple in Egypt. Jews in Egypt had not revolted against Rome. And Vespasian clearly did not want any Jewish temple to remain open and active after the Jewish revolt against Rome. I think that they understood the connection between the temple and the revolt, a connection that we see very clearly again in the Bar Korva revolt on coinage, where you have, for the freedom of Zion and the doors of the Jerusalem temple. So the Romans, I think, understood this connection and deliberately refused to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. And we have to keep in mind, I mean, you could have temples destroyed in wars everywhere, but not to rebuild the temple afterward was unusual. So this was deliberate, but this pertained only to the sacrificial cult. On the other hand, we must also emphasize that the Romans never forbade Judaism as such. They never forbade Jewish customs. They did not prevent the Jews from, receiving oil on a different day when the distribution was made on a Sabbath, for example. They continued to authorize the Jews to have the so-called privileges that they had in the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE. So, and by the way, I absolutely do not consider that the reason for the Bar Korva revolt was the prohibition of circumcision as indicated by the Historia Augusta. I fully concur with Benjamin Isaac's view that the Historia Augusta is not reliable, and with Ra'anan Bustan's conclusion that it was Adrian's project to rebuild Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, which prompted the Bar Korva revolt, and not at all a kind of general ban on circumcision. So just to be very clear on this point.
Okay, so I'm very happy to hear that, and I just want to ask back then about the temple in Egypt. I mean, our only source is Josephus, right? And as far as I remember, he does not draw any connections, and he doesn't like the temple. He hates it basically, but he doesn't make any connection to the revolt, does he?
No, he says explicitly that Vespasian ordered the temple to be destroyed. And
yes, but he does not make any connection that there is a kind of a Roman policy against all sacrificial, types.
You're right, but it's pretty clear that this is what is meant, because why would you destroy this Jewish temple in Egypt? I mean, what for?
Right? Could I?
Yeah.
Could I break in on this point, as long as we're? Actually, I'd like to cite a paper by James Reeves, which appeared in a 2005 Oxford University Press volume, edited by Edmondson, Reeves, and I say under my breath, Mason, where Reeves argued, and it also appears in his book about Roman sacrifice, I think, that when the Romans talked about religio, what they meant was sacrifice. And by destroying the Jerusalem temple, which was an intentional act and not an accidental act, despite Josephus's claim, they understood themselves to be stamping out the religio of the Jews. What was left for the Jews was their mores. And of course, the Romans couldn't control people's mores, and they never tried to control people's mores. They just let them be. But that's a far more aggressive reading than what Maren is proposing. And it actually is in line with whatever Josephus doesn't want to admit this about the Romans, obviously. He's trying to paint a favorable picture of them. He's claimed that Titus didn't really want the destruction of the temple. So he's not going to come out and say, and Vespasian also ordered the temple of Onias to be destroyed out of hostility to the Jews. So I think actually I'm strongly I'm not on Katell's side, because I actually think that it's far worse than what Katell is saying. That the Romans
so we have an interesting discussion.
We're much more aggressive than either of you were saying.
Yeah, so I think there is a very strong political factor, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion now. And I think certainly Titus had no inclination of eradicating Judaism with the destruction of the temple. I thought he was going to break Jewish resistance, and he had no choice. I think that's what he thought he was doing.
But then the question remains, why not authorize the rebuilding after the war? And this is a very serious question, and not just for a few years, but even 30 years later, even 40 years later, they would not allow the Jews to rebuild. And then they would ultimately transform Jerusalem into a Roman city. And this is where the substitution issue comes in, and this is very practical. And that's not in that case, it's not about ideas. It's about real facts on the ground that really Jerusalem disappeared and was replaced by a Roman colony. So, in that sense, really, Rome substituted itself for Israel concretely, practically.
Can this not be compared to Corinth, where also, I mean, Corinth was wiped out and was replaced by a Roman colony?
That there would be other cases.
So is that, do we have a Greek and Roman rivalry here?
I'm not arguing that Rome had a special hatred against Jews. This is not what I'm saying. I'm speaking about Jewish perceptions. So for Jews, it would not matter much whether this had already happened in another context. It mattered that this was happening to them. And then you said, Maren, so what is the evidence for this sense of threat from Rome for the Jews? I think this comes really to the fore precisely in the identification of Rome with Esau. Esau is this evil brother who is a twin, and he wants Jacob, and he wants to get rid of Jacob. I mean, we would say that he has maybe some reasons, to be angry against Jacob in the biblical story, but Jacob feels that Esau is coming to kill him, to get rid of him. So this sense of threat, I think, comes to the fore in the identification of Rome with Esau. But just going back to what Seth just said.
I'm going to just give us the time up. We have a few more minutes before we need to wrap.
So, may I just say something about what Seth just said, just to close on this debate? I understand perfectly your point, but the truth is that in Roman legal texts, including fairly early ones like 3rd century, quoted in later compilations, of course, they use religio to speak about the Jews. They use religio, even though there is no temple and no sacrificial cult anymore. So a nuance, I think, must be taken into account.
Julian, in any case, talks about the Jews sacrificing all over the place in their houses. So whatever the historical truth of that is.
Well, probably limited, but yeah, I think those later quotations are filtered through several centuries of Christian transmission also, which can't be, it's a possibility.
Yeah, but he thought that
I have to interrupt again. Katell.
Sorry, Maren, I didn't have time to answer to all your points. We can continue the discussion.
We can just, yeah, exactly.
Any last remark, Katell?
Well, thank you again to all of you. I mean, really, I've really liked very much everything that I've heard, and very stimulating, very, very precious for me to get this feedback on my book. This is really, really a great gift. Thank you.
I'm going to join Katell in this sentence and express my sympathy, my really complete agreement with her that this is a rare opportunity to discuss seriously an academic a book that makes an impact. And thank you both for taking it seriously and leading this wonderful discussion with so many points and so many aspects to consider. Congratulations, Katell, on this wonderful work, and thank you all for coming and joining us tonight, and have a pleasant evening or night.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fascinating.